Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another KuppingerCole webinar. Our topic for today is how to stop attacker movement in your network before they reach your crown jewels. My name is Alexey Balagansky. I'm a lead analyst at KuppingerCole, and today I'm joined by Wade Lenz, who is a principal solutions architect at Illusive Networks. Before we begin, just a few words about KuppingerCole ourselves. We are an analyst house headquartered in Wiesbaden, Germany. We are focusing on three major areas of market research, covering identity and access management, cybersecurity, and recently also artificial intelligence. We offer a number of, I guess, the usual services you would expect from an analyst company, research publications, webinars and other events, as well as online learning and advisory projects. On this slide, you can see a short summary of our advisory services for vendors and end users. I won't spend much time on the slide. You will find more information on our website. Speaking of the events, we have a whole range of different events, starting with a small free online webinars like this one today, up to pretty big physical world conferences, if you will, and you will see a list of dates and locations on this slide. So the next one actually starts in a week or so in Frankfurt, Germany, and we already have a few planned both in Europe and in the US for the rest of the year. And of course, our the flagship event is always the European Identity Cloud Conference, which will take place next May in Munich, Germany. A few housekeeping rules. Everyone is muted centrally. You don't have to worry about your microphone. We are recording this webinar and we will publish the webcast along with the slides from both the speakers on our website, and everyone will get an email with a link to those materials. We will have a Q&A part at the end of the webinar, but you are encouraged to submit your questions as soon as you have them, and you can use the questions panel on the GoToWebinar control panel, which is probably on in the lower right corner of your screen at the moment. And our agenda for today is traditionally split into three parts. First, I will do kind of the more general introduction to the topic of our today's webinar, and I will talk about the balancing of real-time visibility and proactive infrastructure hardening to more efficiently mitigate and prevent the modern threats, cyber threats. Then I will hand over to Wade to talk more in detail about approaching this idea, kind of implementing it into a software platform, designing a strategy, and basically explaining how it all works in the end. And of course, we'll have a Q&A session. And without further ado, let's jump directly into the first slide. And this is, of course, KuppingerCole's favorite slide, which shows, or at least attempts to show, the state of typical corporate IT infrastructure in the modern hyper-connected world. So what we used to have 20 or even 10 years ago, a typical castle, the wall and the moat protecting all your crown jewels, all your data behind those walls, was probably a single gateway to the outside world. Just does no longer exist. Your data, your resources, your systems, and more importantly, your users and partners and customers are spread all around the world, definitely outside of your corporate network perimeter. And the more data, the more resources you have outside, the less control you have. And of course, sometimes you even hand that control over to a third party, like a cloud service provider. And of course, with this perimeter eroding, the traditional approach towards cybersecurity just no longer works. The firewall won't help you much. And all this has led to this well-known quote-unquote paradigm shift in IT security in the recent years. Basically, many people would say, okay, we give up. We cannot protect you from a security breach anymore. And the best thing you can do is just to focus on detection. So the earlier you detect a hacker within your network, the more chances you have to survive that breach with as little impact as possible. Though many security tools have been focusing on giving you the best visibility into your infrastructure, into everything happening within the network, with some threat intelligence and in the recent years also machine learning and other fancy stuff thrown into the box. The problem is, of course, that visibility alone, threat detection alone, won't save you from a breach, won't save you from a data loss, from a potential disaster which will just stop your business processes and force you to spend a lot of time and money into recovery. So let's look at the bigger picture. We know this traditional NIST cybersecurity framework, which has defined 5 traditional kind of pillars of comprehensive cybersecurity architecture, which covers proactive protection, real-time detection, obviously, quick response, quick recovery. But first of all, just knowing what's going on, so I kind of identifying your attackers even before an attack happens. This still is valid, this is still relevant, but for kind of practical reason for today's webinar, we'll just kind of boil it down to 3 major areas which are still very relevant for your cyber threat defense architecture. The one we would call preempt. This includes all the traditional proactive security tools which help you harden your infrastructure, harden your assets, even before anything bad happens to them. It's like, it's like the vaccine for your IT quote-unquote body, so to say. Detection, of course, is still relevant, is still very much important. And it still has to be a mix of traditional security tools like antiviruses and more advanced like AI-based security intelligence. And of course, as soon as you detect something, you need tools to quickly understand what is it actually that has happened, so to do a forensic analysis, and to mitigate the problem as quickly as possible through some kind of automated security orchestration, and finally deal with all the non-IT consequences of a breach, talking to the press, legal entities, authorities, and so on. Everything that's included under incident response. So this is the bigger picture. The question is, do traditional tools which we have in our toolkits for decades, are they still relevant? Are they still able to cover all the potential and emerging new types of attacks? Well, this slide I have summarized not a specific new attack types, but more like the general trends we have observed recently. The attackers are, first of all, they are shifting their focus from targeting the infrastructure towards attacking humans. Humans are easy to trick. Humans are the weakest link. Definitely, there is unfortunately still no antivirus which you can install into your brain and protect you from phishing and social engineering and so on. Of course, the actual cyber attacks, if you will, they are designed in a way to avoid that monitoring and detection as best as possible, both by traditional signature-based antiviruses and the more modern indicator of compromise-based tools like behavior analytics. And to do that, they aim to leave as few tracks and traces in your infrastructure as possible, which is why we are talking about 3 major new tactics today. So this will be fileless malware, where malicious code is just not saved on a hard drive or any other persistent media. It resides in the memory. For example, in Windows Registry, it utilizes non-binary technologies to deliver the payload, like for example the PowerShell scripts, WMI, Although it can still, of course, deliver the traditional exploits and malicious toolkits like Mimikatz, for example, to assist in collecting the necessary information for lateral movement within your network. These fileless malware attacks are generally undetectable by quote-unquote traditional antiviruses. Another trend, which is we would call kind of living off the land, meaning that the attackers avoid using any external malicious binaries at all and are only focusing on using the legitimate administrator utilities, be it like, again, PowerShell or any other tool which any system already has installed and which is typically also whitelisted in a security tool. They would also mimic usual admin activities in order not to trip the behavior-based security tools, so they are very difficult to detect even with advanced security analytics solutions. And finally, again, insider threats are tactics which are aimed at people, humans, not computers. You already know, of course, about phishing and spam and all those business email compromise, which basically involve like human-to-human attacks. But of course, there are also attacks which are targeting the traces left by humans on their systems, which are this quote-unquote native connections and credentials, which are always left when you're doing your daily job on your computer, be it a remote session or just an open application or a connection to a privileged system for maintenance. All of these credentials and connections, then they remain in the memory or saved into log files and can be harvested by attackers and used against you. So on this slide, I've attempted to create a diagram showing the typical cyber attack phases. It always starts with attacker kind of getting information about your network, doing some external research, if you will, reconnaissance, and then finding a single place for an intrusion. And then the biggest and the longest phase is always lateral movement. This is an attempt for a hacker to discover other systems within your network and find a possibility to move to those systems, maybe to gain some extra privileges on the way. Anyway, this is lateral movement phase. It can actually last for hundreds of days, and when done right, the hackers, the really advanced, those APT groups, they can do it low and slow, and they have the resources and time to spend kind of lurking around your network for 200 days, for example, when they know that the crown jewels, kind of the ultimate goal, is really worth it. But of course, they would really appreciate if they can do it easier and with a shorter period of time. This is why they're always looking for those tracks, those credentials and interconnections between systems. It could be those credentials which you save in your browser, for example. It could be a SSH key left on your computer. It could be admin credentials for local admins or for domain admins, which are cached in your computer's memory and can be harvested with a tool like Mimikatz, for example. It could be hard-coded access tokens within applications. Lots of other things, even kind of getting access to your application log file can provide some food for those attackers living off the land. So when you think about it, in many cases, the real-life scenario of a cyber attack looks much more like this. The hackers do not need to spend hundreds of days looking around. They just breach the first machine or a system. They harvest all those connectivity traces, and they already know kind of the shortest route to the next machine to breach and the credentials to do it. And they just kind of hop directly towards your crown jewels. And instead of hundreds of days, they only need hours, maybe. The question is, how do you prevent it? when we discussed this webinar sometime earlier, I've heard of this really nice term, Cyber-Hygiene Basics. And I've put it into quotes because they aren't really that basic. So yeah, to do this traditional way, you need to deploy a combination of various security tools, endpoint detection and response, behavior analytics. Of course, you need to manage your privileged accounts properly with a key vault and stuff like that. You need some kind of identity and access governance tool to detect improper accesses to systems or to detect users who have too excessive privileges. And of course, you need a network monitoring tool to look for anomalies in the traffic within your network. These are the quote-unquote basics. Unfortunately, for many companies, they tend to pile up to a level where they just don't have either budget or skills to implement it the proper way. The question is, do we have an alternative? And in fact, we do, and this is exactly the topic of our today's webinar. We are going back to this term I used earlier, lateral movement defense. Instead of kind of trying to cover each gap in each system within your network against all possible attack scenarios, you start thinking like a hacker. You start looking for things which a typical attacker would be looking for, and you kind of you apply your cyber hygiene directly to those things. And those things include some fancy sounding technologies like next generation vulnerability management or deception technologies or quote unquote next gen key management. But in reality, it's not rocket science. It's just doing what you have done for years with firewalls and vulnerability scanners. It's just you have to start looking in other corners of your network, if you will. You have to focus not on the systems themselves, but on those connections between the systems. And if you manage to implement some kind of a consistent platform, if you will, technology and architecture to do the same job those hackers would be doing, kind of to scrape your network for those tasteful modules, those credentials and interconnections, and then just preemptively remove those, you will make the lateral movement for a potential hacker way, way more complex and complicated. And this is exactly what we are talking about today. So in a sense, we are talking about starving the attacker. And this is my masterpiece of PowerPoint animation where I try to show how such an attack would look for a hacker. So they would try to attack the network as they expect, looking for those pathways and credentials. Unfortunately, you have already invested into removing those unnecessary pathways. So you have blocked them either manually or through a firewall policy or maybe through some kind of automation tool. That's not my job as an analyst to explain. That will be a task for Wade later today. But you do cut those unnecessary lateral movements opportunities for him. And then, of course, you start removing all those unnecessary credentials. You are clearing up your users' browser caches, for example. You force them to remove those statically hard-coded credentials from applications and so on. And finally, you deploy, and this is optional, but pretty useful as well, you deploy those quote-unquote deception technologies, some kind of mousetraps, which would, on one hand, detect the presence of a hacker trying to access exactly that piece of information you have just removed. On the other hand, they will create many distractions for the hacker, where they would be forced to spend some time looking at phantom systems, phantom credentials, which look just like real ones but don't work anywhere. So in a sense, you are starving the attacker, removing all those living off the land opportunities for him. And of course, you always end up doing all the rest, the proper stuff. Like, for example, you connect your privileged account management, and you also put all those really secure, kind of really relevant secure keys to your highly secure systems, your crown jewels, under that privilege management. In a sense, you end up with a network which leaves for an attacker no possibility to do it the easy way, if you will. So you have preemptively hardened your network without spending a lot of effort on the actual kind of system security. You just cleaned up the garbage, if you will, the digital garbage. So ideally, such a tool should be completely automated. You don't have to do it manually, because otherwise you will spend at least as much time as an attacker. And this is exactly what Wade will be talking on his part. But before I give him the stage, let me just quickly summarize what I've been talking about today. So first of all, yes, traditional perimeter security is dead. Still, you cannot rely on forensics alone, on detection alone, to save you from those attacks. Those new types of attacks cannot be detected by traditional tools, so you do have to think about these new types of advanced techniques and tactics. And for that, for dealing with them, proactive target hardening is still relevant. You just have to look into the different corners of your infrastructure, if you will. So this native connectivity, these credentials and pathways are the new food for the traditional living off the land attack. Sorry. And the lateral movement prevention is the new ground for quote-unquote next generation vulnerability management. And finally, you still have to think holistically. You still have to think about integrating this new type of security technology with your existing identity management, security, and operational tools as well, leaving no gaps for the attacker in the end. And with that, Wade, the stage is yours.
Excellent. Thank you, Alexei, and thank you for the opportunity to partner with KuppingerCole for this presentation. So appreciate that overview on the method and the problem. And so today at Illusive, we want to take a minute and just describe the method that we use to stop attacker movement in a network. The idea, I think we've acknowledged that, attackers will get access to systems. The question gets to our ability to deny them access to the really sensitive bits in the network, and to keep business continuance and sensitive data sensitive. So let's see. So what we're going to do is look at two different elements in this process. The first being the hygiene process that is essential, and really just acknowledging that the normal business activity creates these opportunities for attackers. And so how are we cleaning up behind ourselves in an automated fashion to simply, as Alexei said, starve the attacker and deny them these elements? And then we're going to look at some capabilities for managing the attack surface itself, and really putting the burden back on the attacker as they attempt to exploit our environments. So the first thing I want to point out is that what attackers leverage to move laterally with a living off the land method or whichever method that they employ is the actual data that is on our systems. We're really moving below the application layer now on our host and examining the data that the attacker leverages to make these movements. So Alexei talked a little bit about living off the land. Obviously, lateral movement can be done a number of ways. Living off the land is one of the more difficult to deal with because as an attacker avoids using custom binaries and whatnot, our signature-based systems become less effective. Also, there's this tendency to avoid the use of quote-unquote unknown vulnerabilities, 0 days and 0 hour type attacks. Once those objects are used, they become known to us. We build defenses for them. So as a cybersecurity team, once an attacker has leveraged a vulnerability, we become aware of it and we build IOCs, and so it's and signatures, and so they're hesitant. The attacking community is to use those unless it's kind of a last resort. One of the things that we find is that the native passwords and connections created by the business become very effective tools for movement within the environment, and this becomes the preferred method for the attacker, in many cases even waiting to see what the user does on the system that they've gained access to before they're willing to make a move also. So what we realize is that if we think like an attacker, we can actually manage the credential and connection data that fuel lateral movement and deny attackers really their favorite weapon, which is to live off the land. So we'll get into a little more specifics about how this is being played out, and I'll just go ahead and build this out. What we're seeing in post-breach investigation is that stolen credentials, privilege abuse, you know, the main goal of phishing now is credential theft, and we see this not just rising, but rising dramatically. You know, one of the things Alexei talked about was the speed and efficiency that an attacker can move through our environment when these kind of credentials and these kind of connection data is gathered and collected. So when we look at this data from post-breach investigation, what we realize is that our vulnerability management programs, you know, as security organizations generally, have not adapted to this kind of vulnerability. It's true, we look at vulnerabilities in applications and operating systems, but the data layer, that the credential and connection data layer, most organizations haven't adapted to that yet. And as attacks become more and more automated, we are seeing a movement towards attacker tools harvesting this data in an automated fashion. Not that long ago, harvesting this information was generally more of a manual process, and we're definitely seeing that move to being an automated process. So when we're looking at these pathways in the data, let's get a little bit more specific about exactly what we're talking about. One of the elements in this is domain user credentials and connection information. And we see it all over the place, whether it's in browsers, historical connections using, you know, other applications like PuTTY or WinSCP and different tools. Obviously, domain user credentials can be stored in a local operating system in the Windows Credential Manager. And we look at how these credentials are being stored and saved on the endpoints themselves, just like an attacker is doing. And I think Alexei made a great point, is one of the things that we're doing is we're taking the attacker perspective to look at our systems the same way they do. RDP connections. This is a favorite tool of attackers. We use RDP in a lot of Windows environments for remote administration, and that when this is done in a sloppy manner, there are ways to take advantage of this, both on the source of the system, but also on the target, depending upon people that are saving credentials in the RDP client or leaving behind orphan sessions that aren't shut down correctly. And these are just a gold mine for attackers. Unmanaged local administrator accounts. Local administrator accounts continue to be a source for attackers and an area of difficulty for us as security teams. There's newer tools in the market, obviously, with now Windows 10. There's a native Active Directory capability in LAPS to manage one local administrator account, but we tend to see higher numbers of these that are unmanaged, and it's a huge opportunity for the attackers. Shadow administrator accounts, very powerful. These are privileged accounts that are not members of a privileged group, but through ACL this individual account has been given all the permissions to function like a more capable user. And these shadow administrators definitely are a source of concern, especially when these credentials, again, can be stored on systems throughout the environment. And then also service accounts. You know, we see things, you know, at Illusive, when we look at people's environments, we see things like, you know, service accounts logged in interactively. You know, why is this service account that's typically used for application connections to a database, why is it running an interactive session over on this particular host? So these examples are just a few. There's many, many more that create a lot of pain for us and opportunity for the attackers. And looking at that gives us an advantage. So when we go out to look at how large this problem is, I'll just draw your attention to this Poneman study. In particular, the last data point here is when organizations were surveyed, and these are solid security organizations, about their ability to know when just when credentials are being improperly stored on systems, and it was, you know, slightly better than a quarter of organizations felt like they had a grip on that. This is certainly a scary example that talks about how pervasive this issue is. So at Illusive, one of the things that we've done is gone out and worked with our customers to do some assessments of different environments and get a grip on what we actually see in the real world. And so I've got some data here. This first column kind of shows from the customer how many hosts were a part of this assessment. And you can see they go from anywhere from 500 to, you know, over 20,000 systems. And then the different kinds of issues that we identified in these living environments. And so I'm just going to give you a couple of examples, I think, that kind of show how the problem works out. This first organization, just over 2,500 endpoints, we found 30 different instances where a domain admin credential was stored in the Windows Credential Manager of a local host. You know, certainly not egregious, but not very helpful either. That's, you know, 30 different systems where getting access to that system or through another system to that system provided full domain admin access in the environment, and you know, the attackers' problems are all solved for them. In another organization, slightly larger, just over 2,750 endpoints, they're doing a much better job in this space. In that same basic size organization, only one instance of a domain admin found in the Windows Credential Manager. So, you know, hats off to them, good management in that category. However, when we look at shadow administrators, here they're struggling. 20 different shadow administrator accounts, and this is interesting. Those 20 different shadow admins were operating on 9 different systems. So here's where multiple instances of shadow administrators operating on single hosts, a giant opportunity for attacker that can identify this level of data. So let's look at one more facet. We'll jump up to some larger organizations and a different kind of data. This organization, 10,000 endpoints. When we scanned them, we identified 84 existing domain admin-based RDP sessions that were stale, disconnected, and hadn't been used in days, but still living in the memory of that target system. And so there's a huge opportunity for an attacker that it can identify these sessions in operation. It's very, very straightforward to scrape those credentials out of memory. And again, you know, domain admin is captured. In another organization doing fantastic work on this facet, 23,000 systems, not a single instance of a stale RDP session based on a domain admin credential. So very nice work, solid hygiene for them in that facet. However, when we look at unmanaged local administrators, again, a painful situation. 852 different local administrator accounts not being managed on only 743 systems, meaning some of these hosts have multiple local administrator accounts which are not being managed. So what this story tells us is that the problem is quite large. Even organizations that do well in one space struggle to do well in them all. And of course, attackers identify this information and leverage it to their success fairly consistently. So let's move on to managing the attack surface and what we can do, kind of some of the tools that we've developed at Illusive that allow organizations to impede this kind of process and manage this kind of vulnerability. So the first thing that we do is we use an automated perpetual discovery method to actually look at the data that's on production systems across several facets. These four are key. There's additional ones as well, but we look at how credentials are being stored, and we find all kinds of things in this space, but to give the security organization direct visibility into what credentials are stored where, on which systems, and to update that as it changes, right? Because it does. Day in, day out basis, people's behavior changes these processes. One of the next things we look at are crown jewel connections. We look at where in the production environment hosts are persisting data, which would point directly to a crown jewel host or application. And again, that could be data in the memory of this system. It could be in an application like a browser. I mean, the last thing you would want is someone's browser to have not just a bookmark to a favorite spot, which happened to be a crown jewel in your environment, but also to save the credentials in that link, basically saying that anyone that got access to that host would have immediate access to a crown jewel. They just had to be smart enough to go look in the browser history, and it's a one-hop win. And we see these kind of persistent, sensitive connection history to sensitive objects and environments all the time. Obviously, local administrator accounts, huge opportunity for the attacker. Interestingly, a lot of security organizations don't capture full Windows logs off of workstation class entities. And so local administrator accounts become a way to not just perform administrative functions and potentially across a series of hosts if the username and password are replicated off of on multiple workstations. We do see that. But the monitoring typically not able to see some of that behavior because we may not be collecting Windows logs off of workstation class systems. And so Illusive provides direct access and visibility into how local administrative accounts are being leveraged, which local administrative accounts are being managed, which are not, when passwords been updated, et cetera. And then of course, shadow administrators. Obviously, there are other tools out there that will examine Active Directory and give you some visibility into which accounts through ACLs have been granted privileges that are high or excessive. But Illusive actually looks into the production environment, not only identifies the shadow administrator accounts, but shows you where those credentials are in operation and where they're stored. A huge advantage in the environment. So this crown jewel focus and how we build this out at Illusive, I'll just use this quick kind of visualization to show you what this looks like. When we take an attacker perspective in our environments and we start by thinking about our crown jewels and visualizing, this is a visualization out of an Illusive interface. The system over to the right, the glowing star, that's a crown jewel host in the environment. And all the pathways between these systems are marked. And what we've identified basically is where credential and connection data is being stored on these hosts, such that if I examine the host the way an attacker would, and I look for data, it will point me directly at other hosts and potentially give me the credentials to access those systems. Once we've visualized all of the connections that are available, we actually can look at the violating paths to policy. We set policy and say, look, this kind of a connection in this environment provides no value to us organization, and it actually presents a fair amount of risk. And so if an attacker gets access to this, it's a very easy step to the next host and perhaps onto something sensitive. Once we've identified these paths that violate your security policies, this elusive system allows for automated removal of that connecting data from the production systems in an ongoing process, and then alerts you, hey, we've had to clean up this host again. Someone has saved this information. And this basically is why we call this a cyber hygiene play, dealing with a next generation, if you will, of vulnerabilities that can be managed. Take the attacker perspective to identify this information and simply remove it from the environment to starve the attacker of the kind of connections they can ride that are the simplest for them to use and the hardest for us to detect. So jumping back and looking at the Illusive platform, there's really 3 different pillars to our capability. The first is a tool we called Attack Surface Manager. This is the platform that identifies privileged credential and connection data that persists on workstations and server class hosts in your environment, and then automatically cleans that information out of the environment in an ongoing basis. The rest of the platform, there's another tool that is our attack detection system that includes an intelligence and response capability. And what this does is really forces an attacker to reveal themselves using deceptive methodology to really exploit the attacker's affinity for privileged credentials and connection data. We can actually use that against them. So let's take a look at how the whole system plays together in an environment and what that solution would look like. So the first part of the process is, again, to manage the attack surface. This is critical to, as a security team, be able to focus in on our own systems and identify the persistent information on them that can be exploited. So on this visualization, the green hosts represent the actual production host in this environment. The little white call outs there represent connections either to crown jewel systems, or the little person shaped icon represents credentials that are on the system. And what Attack Surface Manager does is it specifically identifies either connection paths or credential data that provides no value to the organization, but in fact is a vulnerability and a great opportunity for the attacker, and simply removes that data. This form of continuous cleanup really starves the attacker. One of the things about this capability that I think is super effective is that it allows us to look at the particular hosts that create the greatest number of vulnerabilities. Here in this visualization, we're seeing this Windows-7-1 host has access to a lot of different either groups or credentials or crown jewel systems. And one of the things that the Illusive platform does, you can see over on the right, that out of a score from 1 to 1,000, this first connection to this IT admin group, simply removing that connection from this Win7 host provides a huge impact based on the number of other systems that potentially could connect through Windows 7-1, right? So we're looking for those choke points where we can get the most bang for the buck with the cleanup, and cutting off the easy flow of movement for the attacker. One thing about this process is that there are general rules included with the system, provide great visibility, but customization becomes an important element. And by that, we would mean that, let's say, storing credentials. There are places where storing credentials could be completely fine. That's a part of your business process that needs to be maintained in this environment. You know, particular credentials can be stored on hosts in this OU. That's fine. We expect that, and so that's not a problem. However, those same credentials stored in another environment might be a giant risk that's unacceptable. And the Illusive Attack Surface Manager has the ability to differentiate those situations and take action accordingly. The next part of the process is where Illusive uses a deceptive methodology to disorient the attacker and to feed them information that makes it extremely difficult now to move without being detected. And so, we can see how this looks to an attacker. Everything in white and green, of course, is legitimate hosts or connection and credential information that we can't remove. These are the workflows within the organization. So the orange objects are all deceptive history and objects that are planted throughout this environment on the production systems themselves. So when an attacker lands on a system and begins to introspect that host for credential and connection data, they're now presented with highly logical, highly believable, deceptive history. And they now have a big data problem trying to determine what's real and what's not real. And when they attempt to move laterally, leveraging the credential and connection data that we've planted on the production system, we detect for that behavior, shutting down the attack and giving access to a differentiation that, hey, that what normally might look like normal user behavior is in fact malicious. I can give you one quick example about how these deceptions become somewhat inescapable to the attacker. Here we can see a very common tool being used on this host. This is Windows Credential Editor. Functions much like Mimikatz, if you will, just gives us visibility into the memory of a system and the credentials that are stored in that memory. We can see in this account, the John Smith account and a DB admin are both logged in. But when Illusive has operated on the system, what happens is that an additional credential has been planted on this system, this admin account, the hash password, and it becomes a juicy target for an attacker. They now are having to pick between the credentials in this system. And what's great about this is that it doesn't matter what tool the attacker brings to bear. Whether they use Windows Credential Editor or Mimikatz or some variant of their, the memory scraper of choice. We're not trying to solve the application, the attacker tool problem. We've gotten down below that at the data layer, so it doesn't matter what tool they bring to the attack. The data that they operate from is where we have manipulated the environment. And then the last element in the process is where when we see attackers attempting to move laterally using the deceptive information that we've planted in the environment, we then send a binary to the source of the behavior and gather real-time forensics off the source machine itself. This gives us outstanding real-time context into what's happening on the system. You can see here we've gathered screenshots directly from the source host, and this gives us great context. And of course, we gather all the usual information you'd expect, running processes and logged on users and network connections and all this kind of stuff. But this is a great way to get instant understanding of what's happening on these systems. So I want to leave time for questions today in the session, but we're very excited about this continuous attack surface visibility and how it really supports the other tools that are in the space. Identity and access management and privilege access management are key elements in our security posture as security organizations. Illusive really provides an outstanding audit capability for those kind of platforms to show security teams exactly how effective these tools are and where the exceptions are being operated. Obviously, vulnerability management, this is a new layer in that kind of discovery and management for organizations. And so the combination of the two, both traditional vulnerability data, but then also credential and connection-based opportunities for the attacker, putting those together gives an organization a holistic look at what can happen in our environments and where attackers could leverage that data. And again, this is how the attacker views our environments, and so there's a huge advantage to us to do the same, and then other layered defenses as well. So with that, I'd like to pass the baton back over to Alexei. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about this problem and the elusive solution. So Alexei, let me turn it back over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Wade. Just let me quickly switch back to my screen. All right. Well, again, thanks a lot. That was a really insightful presentation. And we still have some time left for the Q&A part. So let me quickly remind you, you can use the questions tool on the GoToWebinar control panel to type in your question. I will read them aloud, and we will answer them together, or I will let Wade answer them. And we already have a couple of questions in the queue. And the first one, oh, I really like this one. So if a company already has a PAM, a privileged access management system in place, what added value does your solution can provide on top of that?
Yeah, this is a great question. So one of the things about PAM and IAM solutions is that that's a control function, right? Where we're attempting to control and manage privileged credentials and sensitive identities. But most of those tools don't provide an audit function to actually go out and look into the environment and query all the hosts to identify what credentials are in place that perhaps aren't being managed. We see situations where there, in many cases, are particular accounts that operate outside of PAM and IAM solutions. And Illusive can show you where those accounts are being used. And a lot of organizations use the data that comes out of Illusive to continuously modify and update the rule sets in their PAM and IAM platforms. It's like you know, most organizations obviously do data backups, but you wouldn't trust your backups unless you've done a restore process to audit the effectiveness of your backups, right? And Illusive becomes the audit function behind your PAM and IAM solution. Great question.
Okay, and let me just quickly add on top of that. So even those companies who actually use PAM, and unfortunately not all do, even those companies who do, they're usually focusing those solutions on administrators, contractors, or their own admins, stuff like that. What they often kind of overlook is that nowadays the most privileged users aren't admins. Those are like a CFO or CEO, for example, the one person who can authorize $1 million transfer to an African country, for example. If your PAM does not cover those users, then your PAM is kind of useless in this particular scenario. Okay, let's move on to the next question. That should be an easy one. So are you present in Germany? Do you have a team here in Germany?
Yes, we do. And so we can absolutely connect you with the team. If you reach out to the KuppingerCole team or to myself, we will connect you to the folks that work in Europe.
Okay, next question, and again, please keep them coming. Can most of this functionality be provided by built-in policy controls like GPOs in Active Directory?
Great question. So this question kind of deals with the same issue that we find in identity and access and PAM side, right? We set policy in GPO, but to actually audit for the effectiveness of those policies, we have to look at the endpoints themselves, right? So some things can be controlled by group policy objects in Active Directory. Some things can't, right? Where we're looking at things like, sure, we can define controls for RDP sessions in GPO, but we don't define things in GPO like how browsers are storing data connected to sensitive hosts and crown jewels in our environment. GPOs deal with domain-based objects, but they don't necessarily affect local administrator accounts. And so there's a wealth of information that the Illusive platform provides that really shows you how effective your policies are and gives you an opportunity to tune those policies to the greatest effect in your environment. Yeah, great question.
Yeah, and I guess those Active Directory policies do not apply to Linux's, Macs, and routers and other Windows devices.
Absolutely, great point.
And by the way, kind of following up on this, the next question is very, very relevant. So how actually do you do that? Do you deploy agents on endpoints, or do you do it on the network level? How does it work?
Right. So this is a part of what makes Illusive unique. I think other organizations, other security tools have tried to do this from the network perspective, and it's extremely difficult to do. And so we've taken an approach of gathering this data directly from the endpoints, but without using a persistent agent. And so what we do, it's a unique method, I think, to Illusive. It's going to be more common as we go forward, but Illusive sends a dissolvable binary to the endpoints. It's a small executable that runs typically for about a half a second, and it examines the host, gathers the data, enforces policy, deploys deceptions, and then it completely deletes itself and removes itself. Kills the process. There's no residual on the endpoint itself other than the fact that the data on the system has either been cleaned off or re-added depending upon what's happening. We do this process slightly more often than once a day. About every 20 hours is the default. It's obviously something you can tune. This gives us a number of advantages. First of all, it's just very lightweight on the endpoint. There's no persistent agent there. Second of all, attackers leverage the data that they see when they look at our endpoints and basically look at our security capabilities based on the tools that are running on the endpoint. So the fact that Illusive doesn't deploy an agent is great news for IT operational teams that aren't having to support that overhead. And then again, another layer of difficulty for the attacker. We're not giving away our presence there. And again, there's no agent to attack, right? The system is effective and it really can't be turned off by an attacker.
So in other words, basically, you are a fileless malware.
I didn't say that, Alexei.
Yeah, fileless.
You said that.
Okay.
So what can I say? The company thinks like an attacker, and so that's the method we use.
Right. Okay, next question. So how is your solution different from other detection methods in terms of speed of detection?
Great question. So one of the things that we like about it is the speed. A lot of competitive technologies in our space, a lot of other technologies that are trying to deal with this problem tend to be behavioral analytics solutions, right? Where you're trying to differentiate this behavior from normal when an attacker attempts to move. And really, we've shifted that burden over to the attacker themselves. And so it's a very low false positive, very low noise system. And when it throws an alert, what that means is that we have a positive detection that a process or a user on a production system is leveraging the credential and connection data that we planted on that system. They're attempting to move using that information. And so the system automatically responds to that endpoint in real time to gather the context off of that system. The speed is outstanding. As a matter of fact, our response to endpoints is so efficient that most security teams leverage our response when they get detections from their other tools. So say a proxy system in their environment identifies an outbound connection out of the network to a very low reputation host in DNS. Their system scripts through the Illusive API, Illusive, to reach out to that internal system and gather the forensics data off of it. The user is completely unaware that we're doing this. It's fast and light. But that data has been captured as it's happening before the attacker gets the time to alter logs or kill processes or hide their tracks. And so speed is critical, and the speed of the elusive response is outstanding. Great question.
Okay, and I think we have time left for one last question, which would be this one. Can you work in, well, I assume in non-Windows environments like industrial networks, IoT devices, stuff like that?
Great question. So the solution works in Windows environments. We also have capabilities in Linux as well as Mac space. And so in the Linux environment, we're not actively deploying onto black box Linux systems, but we do deal with the workstation and server class hosts that interact with those kind of IoT and infrastructure-based, SCADA and other devices like that. One of the things that we do is we identify networks that have everything from mainframes to swift wire transfer to the printer infrastructure. We identify all of those objects, and then we use that as part of our deceptive storytelling to lure attackers into interacting with the objects that we plant. So we absolutely leverage that data today.
Okay, great. Well, thanks again, Wade. And with that, we have reached the end of our allocated 1 hour time slot. Thank you very much for all the attendees. I hope to see you, at least to meet you virtually in one of our future webinars. And have a nice day.